Hi, everyone, and welcome back. If you're like us, you want to get to grips with some of the bigger, more complex stories happening, but without wading through mountains of research.
Absolutely, finding clear signals in all the noise.
Exactly. So today we're doing just that. We're taking a deep dive into what our shared sources tell us about these alleged connections between far-right Catholicism, groups like Opus Dei, and the political movement known as Project 2025.
Yeah, these are currents running underneath, the surface, things that don't always get a lot of airtime in mainstream discussion. So bringing them out, trying to understand their significance, it feels pretty crucial.
Couldn't agree more. So our sources for this dive, we've got transcripts from a YouTube channel, The Flying Kitchen by Shannon Vovich, and also an excerpt from a text called Far Right Catholic Agenda, Leo, Opus Dei, and Christendom.
Okay.
And our mission really is to pull out the key insights from these specific materials. What are the goals being described, the methods, and, why should any of this matter to our listeners?
It's really about understanding the why behind it all, isn't it? The motivations and maybe the potential outcomes if these groups are interconnected in the ways the sources suggest.
Right. And central to this web, according to these sources, is a man named Leonard Leo.
He comes up repeatedly.
Yeah, the information we've got suggests he's involved with both Opus Dei and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. These are, long-established international Catholic lay organizations.
Right, and the sources point out these aren't just any groups. Historically, they've acted as influential networks connected to the Vatican.
Yeah.
Deep roots, global reach.
Exactly. And one of the sources gives a pretty stark definition of Opus Dei.
Oh, yeah.
It calls it a fascist far-right Catholic cult within the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
It says it was founded back in the 1930s with a very clear goal to re-Christianize the world.
Re-Christianize the world. Okay, that's a big phrase. What do the sources suggest that actually means in this context?
Well, based on the material, it seems to mean reestablishing a kind of Christian dominance, specifically a Catholic one, on a global scale. Almost like trying to return to an older world order, where religion held much more sway over society.
So not just a spiritual renewal, but something more structural.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Because Project 2025 is presented as the sort of political vehicle for this. And the goal described is, frankly, radical. One source actually suggests it's about setting up a theocracy in the U.S.
A theocracy.
Yeah, and it even mentions the idea of a potential Catholic king. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but that's what's in the source material we reviewed.
That's a huge claim, a fundamental shift away from American principles. We definitely need to look at how the sources back that up.
Okay, so let's dig into that specific goal, this idea of a theocratic Christendom. What's the picture painted by that term in the sources?
Christendom, as described, seems to be this vision where Christianity, but specifically the brand of Catholicism pushed by these groups, is dominant globally. It's framed as maybe recreating a past era where religious authority heavily influenced government and society.
So basically a world run according to very specific far-right Catholic interpretations of Christian belief.
That seems to be the implication.
And the sources claim this movement wants to transform the U.S. into a theocracy, a government led by religious law, with leaders who follow this particular doctrine.
That's the core argument presented, yes. Yeah. A deliberate effort to reshape America's entire governing framework around a specific religious ideology.
And it gets even more specific, like I said, with that mention of a theocratic monarch or a Catholic king.
Which, flies directly in the face of the separation of church and state, a foundational idea in the U.S.
Absolutely. It's a direct challenge to democratic ideals.
No question.
Now, we should be clear. Leonard Leo himself has publicly said he doesn't want a theocracy.
Okay, that's important context.
But one of the YouTube transcripts points this out and argues there's a disconnect. It suggests his actions, perhaps, point towards a different agenda than his public statements. This gap is something the sources seem to focus on.
Right, and that's often the tricky part when analyzing these things, isn't it? The difference between public declarations and maybe the longer-term goals or the practical effects of someone's actions. It forces you to ask how to weigh words against deeds.
And then you have someone like Matt Walsh. According to one transcript, he actually calls himself a fascist theocrat.
He says that openly.
That's what the transcript claims, yeah. And that he believes his religious views should be forced on people by the government. The source explicitly connects that view to Project 2025.
Well, that's about as clear an expression of theocratic intent as you can get. If that's accurate, it provides a very direct example of the kind of thinking the sources attribute to parts of this movement. A complete merging of church and state power.
Okay, so that's the alleged goal, this Christendom. Who are the key players the sources identify as pushing this forward? Leonard Leo obviously keeps coming up.
Yes, the sources really emphasize his influence, particularly on the American judiciary. One transcript claims he's been absolutely central in getting conservative judges appointed, specifically mentioning the Supreme Court.
Right. It claims he stacked the court with, I think the phrase was 6 out of 9 fascist far-right Catholic judges. That's a huge claim about shaping the court's direction for potentially decades.
A very powerful claim, yeah. And it suggests a long-term strategy focused on controlling the legal interpretation of the Constitution.
And the sources also link him to the Federalist Society.
Which is, a well-known conservative legal organization.
Right. One source explains it was originally set up to push back against what they saw as liberal trends in the courts. But interestingly, one perspective in the material suggests Leo's current agenda might actually be diverging from, or maybe even going beyond, what the Federalist Society initially aimed for.
That is interesting. It hints at a possible evolution or maybe a fracture within conservative legal circles. What started as maybe constitutional originalism could be shifting, or at least for some figures like Leo, towards something more explicitly religiously driven based on this source's account.
Then there's Kevin Roberts, who leads the Heritage Foundation.
Okay, another major conservative institution.
Yes, and he's described in the sources as an Opus Dei Catholic who apparently met with far-right groups in Europe and South Korea.
Building international links.
Seems like it. And there's this quote attributed to him that stands out. Something about a new American revolution, potentially bloodless, he says, if the left allows it.
Wow. Bloodless if the left allows it. That's loaded language. It sounds like a warning or maybe even a veiled threat, depending on how you interpret it.
Definitely carries weight, especially in the context of theocracy discussions.
Yeah.
Could imply a justification for pretty radical, maybe even forceful action if they feel it's necessary for their cause.
And the source also mentions a shift at Heritage itself, suggesting Opus Dei influence might be growing there, maybe eclipsing the traditional evangelical power base.
That's what it suggests, yeah. Which, if true, would be a really significant realignment within the conservative movement.
Definitely.
Okay, who else comes up?
Peter Thiel, the billionaire tech investor.
Right, known for his libertarian, sometimes controversial views.
The sources link him to Curtis Yarvin and also J.D. Vance. And the claim is they all share a kind of skepticism or even disdain for democracy and maybe a longing for more authoritarian rule, like monarchy.
So Thiel, Yarvin, Vance. An interesting grouping.
And Thiel, remember, funded the Hulk Hogan lawsuit that bankrupted Gawker. The sources also bring up a connection to something called bro-Catholicism through the Hallow app, suggesting maybe tech money, right-wing politics, and this specific type of Catholicism are intersecting. Thiel's an interesting node, isn't he? Connecting Silicon Valley money and influence with these more anti-democratic, far-right ideas, and linking it to an app like Hallow suggests a way they might be trying to reach and influence, younger Catholics, maybe.
And speaking of Curtis Yarvin,
also known as Mencius Moldbug.
right, he's pegged as the main thinker behind the neo-reactionary movement, which openly pushes for a return to monarchy.
Yeah, his ideas are pretty out there. The whole exit society concept, this belief in a natural hierarchy, a ruling class, it's a complete rejection of modern democracy.
Definitely provides an ideological bedrock for some of these authoritarian leanings mentioned.
For sure.
And then J.D. Vance. The sources describe him as a fairly recent convert to Catholicism who aligns with this movement.
Okay.
It notes his alleged criticisms of Europe, of childless women with cats, of higher education, and suggests these views echo those of his handlers or associates within this network, portrays him as an important political voice for this agenda now.
So Vance's conversion and his political positions are presented as fitting into this larger ideological puzzle. His public statements, as the source sees them, help amplify the movement's narrative.
Okay, so we've got the alleged goal, some key players. What about the how? What strategies and ideologies do the sources say are being used?
Well, one interesting strategy described is this kind of division of labor.
How so?
The sources suggest that evangelical and maybe Mormon communities are used for the grassroots stuff, the mobilizing, the visible campaigning.
Getting out the vote, that kind of thing.
Right. While the far-right Catholic elements, particularly those associated with Opus Dei, according to the sources, operate more quietly, behind the scenes, working within institutions, pulling levers of power more discreetly.
So a coordinated effort But with different roles for different groups,
Right.
that implies some serious organization.
It does. And then there's the ideology underpinning it all, particularly Catholic integralism.
Right. What exactly is that, based on the sources?
It's basically a political theology. It argues that Catholic principles shouldn't just guide personal life, they should be integrated into the laws and structures of the state. It sees secular liberal democracy as inherently flawed.
So the state should actively promote Catholicism.
Essentially, yes. Political authority and the Catholic Church should work together, according to this view, to uphold Christian morality and the common good as they define it. It's the justification, really, for the theocratic aims we talked about.
And this isn't mainstream Catholic teaching, right?
No, definitely not universally held. It's more of a traditionalist viewpoint that's apparently gained traction in these specific far-right circles described by the sources.
So it connects back to that Opus Dei goal of re-Christianizing the world.
Exactly. But the sources draw a sharp contrast. They say more liberal Catholics might see that as leading by example, through faith and good works,
Whereas this far-right interpretation,
is presented as wanting to achieve it through political power, legal means, maybe even force if necessary. It's a much more assertive, potentially coercive approach.
and that leads into the concept of the church militant. The sources bring this up too.
Yeah, and that term has some pretty dark historical baggage, doesn't it? Connected to the Crusades, religious violence.
That's exactly the concern raised, that this idea of the church being at war with evil could be used, again, to justify really ruthless actions to achieve their goals.
It's a theological concept, the church on earth fighting against sin, but the sources worry it's being twisted to justify, well, earthly conflict and coercion.
And it gets even more disturbing. There's mention of, within this extreme viewpoint, a potential dehumanization of people who aren't baptized.
Which is deeply troubling.
Yeah, the implication being that if someone isn't seen as fully human in their eyes, it could theoretically make violence against them seem justifiable.
That kind of thinking, dehumanizing any group, is historically a precursor to awful things.
Yeah.
It's a massive ethical red flag if that's truly part of the ideology.
And finally, on methods, the sources allege some very serious things: dark money channels, accusations of human trafficking abuse, and a concerted effort to infiltrate major societal institutions.
Wow. Those are explosive allegations. Dark money suggests hidden influence and a lack of transparency.
Right.
The trafficking abuse claims are horrific and demand investigation if there's evidence. And infiltration points to a long game strategy to gain control across society, government, media, education, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. It paints a picture of a highly organized, well-funded, and potentially ruthless operation, according to these sources.
Okay, so given all that, what are the main concerns or maybe contradictions that stand out from these materials?
Well, one big one seems to be a disconnect. The sources suggest many ordinary Catholics, and maybe even evangelicals involved at the grassroots level, might be completely unaware of the full scope of this alleged agenda.
So a lack of transparency within the movement itself. People mobilize for one stated reason, while the leadership allegedly has a different, more radical endgame.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Yeah,
Which raises concerns about manipulation.
definitely. And you also mentioned the conflict with Pope Francis.
Yes, that's a major point.
Wow.
His more inclusive, less rigid approach is presented as being completely at odds with the exclusionary traditionalist agenda of this far-right faction.
And they reportedly want him replaced, with
Ah.
Cardinal Burke mentioned.
That's what one source claims, yes. It really highlights a deep ideological battle happening within the Catholic Church itself. The stakes feel very high.
A struggle for the direction of the church, essentially.
Seems like it. Then there's this straightforward accusation that these fascist far-right Catholics, as the source labels them, are using lies and smoking mirrors to advance their cause.
So deliberate deception as a tactic.
That's the claim, which again raises serious ethical questions about their methods, if true.
Of course. What else?
This odd contradiction, the
That's-
persecution complex. The sources suggest some people in this movement feel victimized or under attack, despite apparently wielding significant influence, like in the judiciary.
Right, the feeling of being persecuted while simultaneously holding considerable power. It's a known phenomenon in some movements, isn't it? It helps rally the base, justifies aggression, even if the perception of being persecuted doesn't quite match the reality of their influence.
Yeah, it's a strange dynamic. And then briefly, the sources touch on possible links to Russia.
Russia, how does that fit in?
The theory presented is that these groups might see Putin's Russia, with its emphasis on social conservatism and traditional values, as more ideologically aligned with them than, say, liberal Western Europe.
And An enemy of my enemy kind of thinking, perhaps. Or a genuine affinity for that style of socially conservative authoritarianism.
Could be either, or both. There's even a mention of a potential goal to unite the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Maybe seeing Russia as key to that. It adds this whole geopolitical layer to it.
Fascinating. A potential realignment based on shared social views, overriding other historical or political differences.
And finally, the sources bring up Franco's Spain from 1939 to 1975.
As a historical example.
Exactly. As an example of what a Catholic integralist state actually looked like in practice. The sources stress its authoritarianism, the huge influence of the church, the political repression, human rights abuses, censorship.
Stolen children.
Stolen children, yeah, oppression of women, LGBTQ plus people. And the really chilling part is the sources explicitly suggest this is the model that the far right in the U.S., as described, is aiming for.
That is a deeply disturbing comparison. Using Franco's regime as the template, it gives a very concrete and frankly terrifying shape to the abstract idea of a theocracy.
It really does. So, wrapping this all up, the picture emerging from these specific sources is pretty concerning. It describes what it claims is a well-funded, organized, far-right Catholic movement.
Allegedly using groups like Opus Dei, figures like Leonard Leo.
To gain political power, influence the judiciary, and ultimately aim for a theocratic state in America. And the potential impact on democracy, on individual rights, especially for those outside their specific religious framework, seems enormous.
The core takeaway from these sources seems to be this alleged ambition to completely reshape American society based on a very particular traditionalist Catholic ideology. And that Franco comparison serves as a stark warning about what that could mean in practice.
It really underscores why paying attention to these alleged connections and goals, as laid out in the sources we looked at, feels important. It's about understanding the kind of future these groups might be trying to build.
Awareness is key. Just understanding the arguments being made, the players involved, the potential goals, that's the starting point.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on. When you consider that historical example, Franco Spain, and you hear the goals described in these sources, what does this idea of Christendom in America actually mean? What would it look like for individual liberty, for the separation of church and state?
Yeah, what would daily life be like under such a system? What happens to dissent, to diversity of belief or non-belief? Those are the crucial questions, aren't they?
Absolutely. And if this deep dive has sparked your interest, the sources we used, again, were transcripts from The Flying Kitchen by Shannon Bavich on YouTube. That could be a place to start further digging.
And the book Opus by Gareth Gore was mentioned in those videos as a key resource, too.
Right. We definitely encourage listeners to do their own research on Leonard Leo, Opus Dei, Project 2025, the history of Catholic integralism, the Franco regime. Look at various sources and form your own informed opinions.
Absolutely. Dig deeper, read widely, think critically. That's always the best approach.